Hi everyone. For today's featured vessel, we're going to be looking at the Warrimoo. You may have not heard of the ship, but chances are you've seen this image pop up on social media with a very interesting tale. This tends to pop up around New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, and on social media the story goes is that the Warrimoo was on a voyage on the 31st of December 1899, and it just so happened at midnight to cross at the intersection between the equator and the international dateline, therefore putting it in essentially two places at once, at one end of one century, at one end of the other century, and essentially two places in time. It's a wonderful, fun story that has made the rounds. However, on closer inspection, the story doesn't quite live up to its wonderful reputation. And if you want to be disappointed, then please continue watching, because we are going to look into a little bit more detail into this story, as well as into the life of the Warrimoo itself. So, this incredible feat of navigation and time and space popped up after 1942. When the Warrimoo completed this particular voyage in December 1899, the voyage itself was actually reported in the Sydney Morning Herald, and you can see the article there. It is worth noting that it was a particularly rough voyage, and the weather only improved from the 3rd of January onwards. Fast forward to 1942, and this article in an Ottawa newspaper popped up recounting the incredible feat of navigation whereby the first officer convinced the captain that yes, we should position the ship at this particular point in time and space, and thus it was done. Unfortunately, this happened 40 years after the event. We do not have the logbooks to corroborate. We do not have accounts from either the captain or the first officer either. And the immediate flaw in this story is that the weather was calm, when in actual fact, based on the newspaper information at the time, no, the ship was sailing through a north by northwest gale with moderate winds, so conditions would have been more like this. So any intention or expectation that once the ship had made this feat of navigation on the 31st of December 1899, that suddenly all the passengers and crew burst into Auld Lang Syne and there's a morning after, is just complete hokum. What we can say with definitive proof is that the Warrimoo on the 31st of December 1899 did cross the equator. Everything apart from that is pure speculation. It still makes for a good story, but unfortunately those are the verifiable facts that we have, and thus we can say that it just simply crossed the equator on that night. In terms of the Warrimoo itself, it was named after a small township in the Blue Mountains, which is a region west of Sydney. Named the Blue Mountains because when Captain Cook viewed them through his telescope, the mountain range looked blue. The ship itself was one of two sister ships. The Warrimoo was one of two sister ships, its twin being the Mayowera. Both vessels were built for the Australian company Hoodett Parker, and James Hoodett, who was the CEO, was one of those types that tended to go on initiative, instinct, without dealing with his board of directors, so there were some interesting board meetings. He basically had an idea of building two ships that would compete on the New Zealand run. At the time, the New Zealand run had been dominated by the Union Steamship Company, and thus competition occurred. These ships, after an agreement had been reached, were then transferred over to a new shipping subsidiary that would service Canada. And this was a joint venture between these ships and initially the New Zealand Steamship Company and then Union Steamship Company. And in that run, the Warrimoo and its sister looked like this. Although, after I generated this image, I realized actually that the funnel was all white and a cross was the logo of the company, but the ship's hull was indeed white. 1893 comes and goes, and the tremendous banking crisis sends the world into a global depression, which is worse than the more famous depression of the 30s. And an agreement is reached whereby the Union Steamship Company would acquire the Warrimoo, and then further down the track, its sister ship. These ships may look small, and indeed by today's standards they are puny. In fact, some of the dining rooms of today's giga cruise ships could probably comfortably fit these entire ships in their entirety. However, for context, the vital statistics of the Warrimoo are as follows. Completed by Swan Hunter in Newcastle, the Warrimoo weighed 3,529 gross tons, was 360 feet long, which equates to about 109 meters, and had a beam of 42 feet, which equates to 12.8 meters. The triple expansion single-propelled vessels could run at a maximum of 17 knots when pressed, which was quite impressive, but their standard service speed was 15 knots. Their older and smaller Union Steamship Company competitors were able to out-endure these two ships. Warrimoo, while speedy, was speedy in short bursts. It could not sustain high speeds for very long. After the Warrimoo was acquired formally by the Union Steamship Line, the ship was repainted into their typical green hulled and red and black funnel colors, and the ship was transferred to Trans-Tasman Trades. Its sister ship was also eventually acquired, renamed the Matai, and served as a backup ship for the Pacific run. The Matai had a terrible tendency of either running aground or getting swamped by waves, and it was in 1916 that the Matai would ultimately run aground despite every effort of its captain and crew to avoid it, but forces were working against it, and the ship ran aground. And amazingly, to this day, you can still see the triple expansion engine poking out of the water, and it is diveable in certain circumstances. I've linked a video below that shows the triple expansion engine poking out of the water. It's quite incredible to see. But back to our Warrimoo. The ship operated well into the First World War. On the 17th of May 1918, with over 1,700 troops on board, the Warrimoo collided with its escorting French destroyer, the Catapult. And while the collision itself wasn't too serious, what happened afterwards was depth charges broke loose from the stern of the Catapult, fell into the water, and detonated. The damage incurred from those explosions not only sent the Catapult sinking immediately with the loss of 56 crew members, but the bottom plates of the Warrimoo were blown in and its fate was sealed. Unfortunately, one person was lost. Everyone else managed to get off safely. And it was in this dramatic fashion that the Warrimoo sank. And considering those circumstances, it probably should be better remembered for its loyal service, its dramatic entry, and its explosive end, rather than for this fun fact that isn't 100% true. If you wish to learn more about this ship and its entry into service, look no further than this book, Hudat Parker, a famous Australasian shipping company, 1876 to 1971, written by W.A. Laxon. It is the complete history of the company, its fascinating founder, and its the dramatic events that got it into business and all its side quests that went on there. Another book that is worth highlighting because Australian shipping is fundamentally underrepresented in the national consciousness is this one, Passenger Ships of Australia and New Zealand, Volume 1, written by the great Peter Plowman. This is one of 2 volumes. And this book as well delves into the operation of the Warrimoo. And interestingly enough, none of these books bring up this particular voyage of 1899. It is one of those things that tends to have popped up in the digital age. So there you have it, Warrimoo with its slightly dubious claim to fame.